This episode, I'm joined once again by writer and occultist John Michael Greer to discuss Freemasonry. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers, making all this work possible. And if you'd like to keep the podcast running, please find links for the Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, John Michael Greer, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you again for having me on.
We are going to be discussing Freemasonry, and you have two books, so The Secret of the Temple, Earth Energy, Sacred Geometry, and the Lost Keys of Freemasonry. This was published in 2017, I believe. And you also have The Ceremony of the Grail, Ancient Mysteries, Gnostic Heresies, and the Lost Rituals of Freemasonry 2023. Both dealing with Freemasonry in their own way. Secret of the Temple has much more of a foundation of an introduction to Freemasonry. But what both of these do, so as I was saying before we start recording, I went into this thinking, okay, Freemasonry, this will be a little bit more straightforward because the last time we had a discussion, it was on Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn sort of famously they've got their finger in, well, I would now say they've got their finger in many pies. And I would now say that Freemasonry has its fingers in just like every single possible pie you can imagine. So I was reading these books thinking,
just about.
Yeah. I was reading your books thinking, dear me, I'm astounded you managed to keep it all together in these books. But before we dive into all these just huge threads that I am going to struggle to transition between in this discussion, just your history with Freemasonry, why did you join, and I guess what springs to mind for you when someone says Freemason?
Okay, I'll do the history first. I was, as the Masons say, entered, passed, and raised through the 3 degrees of craft masonry in 2001. I joined partly because I knew some guys who were Masons and I liked them, partly because I knew a fair amount about the craft's history, and partly because I was at that point a hardcore practitioner of Golden Dawn magic, and all of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn were Masons, and they drew very heavily on their Masonic background in creating that order. So I wanted basically to see the earlier version. I wanted to see the resources that they used in constructing the rituals. That definitely started a journey. Masonry is a very complicated thing. It started out as something very simple. It started out as a guild, just a bunch of stonemasons, basically, who organized like any other medieval guild. They had their apprentices, they had their journeymen or fellow crafts, they had their masters, and you earned your way, you worked your way up from one level to another. And then in the 17th century, they started admitting people who were not stonemasons, because they had, these are the guys who built the cathedrals, okay? They had a lot of neat symbolism. People who were interested in that wanted to join, and it spun out of control. So what I think of when I think of Freemasonry, of course, this is American Freemasonry. There are huge differences from one country to another. In America, Freemasonry is not an upper-class thing. It's not even a middle-class thing. It's mostly lower middle class and upper working class. You are much more likely to meet a construction worker, a small contractor who has 3 employees, somebody who works in a shop, this kind of thing, than you are to meet doctors and lawyers, much less the wealthy and well-connected, the movers and shakers. So what I think of when I think of Freemasonry at this point is a bunch of guys, these days evenly divided between very, very old and scattered through the various other ages, who have these remarkable archaic rituals which they do not even begin to understand, but which they still practice very earnestly and insist that, yes, these are our rituals and we can't possibly change them. We just don't know why.
That's, I wasn't going to say it, but that is the feeling I got going through your books is there's multiple times where you sort of have to say, look, there's all this, and we just don't really know why we do it. Yeah, I guess we'll get into this. especially with the rituals, because there's something interesting there, I guess, with sort of the metaphysics of how rituals work, why they work, if. But before we do so, because I want to just give this foundation of Freemasonry, because the reason I phrase that in the sense of what do you think of when you think of Freemasonry is because for a lot of people, because of mainstream media and films as well, if you said Freemason, people start thinking of Illuminati. They'll start thinking of cabals, of conspiratorial,
sinister plotters seeking to overthrow everything. Yeah, if not actual lizard people from space. Oh, I know.
It's a shame. It's a shame. So in terms of
it's a shame, but it's also kind of amusing.
Okay, well,
we joke about that. We joke about that kind of thing all the time.
Well, I'm sure you do when you're, maniacally laughing. And
and rubbing our hands together.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course,
Well, we can get to that when we get to sort of the rereadings of the origin, because there's so many. But
yes,
the actual origins in terms of we have this meeting in 1717 with which are Masons, but prior to this we have sort of the origin of the symbolism, and we could say the law is from here, from an extremely minor figure in the Bible, Hiram Abiff. And
Hiram Abiff was brought in later.
Okay.
Here's the thing that most people don't realize. The Master Mason degree, the degree in which Hiram Abiff features, was not part of Freemasonry in 1717. Okay. It was brought in 1720.
Oh.
Nobody knows from where.
Okay, so do you think this was a case of they had this meeting, they wanted to just start a Masons group, and then someone thought 3 years down the line, someone thought, maybe we should make this a bit more rooted in something?
I think it was a bit more. I think it was a bit more complex than that.
Okay.
Keep in mind what was going on in British politics in 1717. In 1714, the last of the Stuart queens, Queen Anne, had just died. And the House of Stuart in the exiled House of Stuart on the continent, the Old Pretender, notionally James III, tried to push his way in, push his claim to the throne, and was rejected by Parliament. They invited the German prince who became George I. The supporters of the Stuart House, the Jacobites, rose in rebellion and got stomped. And so you had a lot of Jacobites who fled Britain for France and other places. So, 2 years after that, all of a sudden, these Masonic lodges, which had been really fringe, or just these very quiet organizations without any noticeable networking at all, but may have been, there were probably some connections. We can get into that between some of those lodges and the first Jacobite Rising, the 15. All of a sudden, you have the organization of the first Grand Lodge of England, very much under Hanoverian auspices. So there was politics going on there, even at that time. And they didn't have the Master Mason degree. They didn't have the third degree. Now, every guild had 3 degrees, without exception. That's still true of the surviving guilds in British life. There's always an apprentice degree, there's a fellow craft or journeyman degree, and there's a master degree. So my guess is what happened is that when the Hanoverians got organized, the first Grand Lodge of England, what happened was that they didn't have any members who had the Master Mason degree. They might have had somebody who had received it, but who actually knew it and could confer it. And then my argument in the Ceremony of the Grail is that they brought in a different ritual, probably from Scotland. And that's where Hiram Abiff entered the whole Masonic situation.
Would you say that the Hiram Abiff story and origin story is maybe not factually considered?
As fact, it's complete balderdash. There's no evidence.
But fact aside, I'm sure most Freemasons acknowledge that maybe you never find out the true origins. But facts aside, is it the most popular? The most notable origins?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, and depends on how they're talking. Most Masons, I think, realize that the whole Hiram Abiff origin story it's simply a story. It's the center of the Master Mason degree as we now have it. But I don't know that anybody takes it that seriously these days as the actual account of when and where Masonry is, when it was founded. I don't think anybody claims that, well, certainly not in American Masonry, claims that Masonry goes all the way back to the building of the Temple of Solomon. We use the Temple of Solomon symbolically, but most Masons that I know of, they either accept the sort of sober historical view that it came into being out of a medieval stonemasons guild, or they're into the slightly more romantic view that stonemasons guild absorbed members from the Knights Templar after the Knights Templar was dissolved. There's some evidence supporting that.
Okay. Can I mean, I'm going to ask it. Can we expand upon the Knights Templar?
Oh, sure.
Tale?
Okay, then, so we have the Knights Templar. We have one of the three great crusading orders. Think of them as the Christian equivalent of Shaolin monks. Okay, they're monks, but they're also fighters. Except, of course, Shaolin monks use primarily their bare hands. Knights Templar generally use swords and spears and lots of armor and things. Warfare was different in the two cultures. So you have the Knights Templar, founded in 1118. And then dissolved about 300 years later. No, about 200 years later, excuse me. Originally, the process lay from 1307 to the early 1320s. And they were known for building castles all over the Holy Land and in several other parts of the areas that were being contested with the Muslim world at that time. They also had plenty of churches and granges and barns and other buildings all over Europe because they owned a lot of land, and they had to gather the grain and ship it to the Holy Land to feed the knights there. So they had architects, they had builders, they had people who could build things with stone. The claim is that in Scotland, at the time the Templars were formally dissolved by the Pope, Scotland was under interdict at that point. A long, complex story involving Robert the Bruce and the English King Edward II of England, and so on and so forth. But being under interdict, the papal edicts were not enforced or even promulgated in Scotland at that time. So the Templars, the claim goes that the Templars helped Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn. Mm-hmm. And so when the interdict was finally lifted, the arrangement was quietly made by the Scottish monarchy to let the Templars just kind of go to ground and not persecute them as had happened in most other countries. And so that the theory is that was when a bunch of Templar builders, a bunch of Templar stonemasons, ended up going to work as working stonemasons in Scotland, in and around Edinburgh, and they brought certain teachings and traditions with them. It's not especially complex. There were certainly plenty of Templars in Scotland at the time the edict dissolution was pronounced. They had a big base at a town with the gloriously Scottish name of Ballantradoch. It's called Temple nowadays, quite sensibly. And interestingly, it's about 4 miles down the road from Rosslyn Chapel, but we can let that pass. But yeah, so there were a lot of Templars in Scotland. Nobody's sure what happened to them. There are gravestones from long after the whole business about the dissolution of the Templars that have Templar symbols on them, oddly enough. And so there's some evidence. There's still a lot of debate back and forth, but I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that. So that's as far back as most people are willing to go within the craft, unless they've gotten into some of the giddier speculations. And oh my, are there giddy speculations?
Well, so before we get to the really giddy speculations, because that'll probably help us ground the conspiratorial myth, which I think is important to unwind if you can. But before we get to that, just one of the maybe less, as you described them, giddy but less giddy, which was originally, I believe it was originally put forth by Thomas de Quincey. So the notion that Freemasonry might be sort of an outgrowth of Rosicrucianism. So this one seems at least at least somewhat a bit more tenable.
It's entirely plausible. There aren't a lot of direct traces, but it's not impossible. It's certainly not impossible because there were Rosicrucian circles in Scotland. There were a lot of people all over the British Isles. There were various groups of people who picked up on the Rosicrucian furor, who were eagerly reading books by Michael Meyer and Robert Flood and things like that. And a significant number of these figures ended up in the very early days of the Freemasonry as not just a guild. So yeah, that's whether it was the source. It was certainly a significant. It became a significant input, and in fact, there are now Rosicrucian degrees in some branches of Masonry.
Okay. So I feel from your mention of these Giddy origin stories, is there any that spring to mind that you sort of wish to mention that maybe you've taken, any that either you find excessively laughable, or that you or ones that you perhaps particularly want to dispel as your I believe you're a 32nd degree.
I'm 32nd degree in the Scottish Rite. I'm a Knight Templar in the York Rite. We can explain those later. Okay. I belong to various other invitational things. I have not been given my secret decoder ring and as Master of the Universe or anything like that. So maybe that's the problem. But the thing is, people will just go to town. There's this long passage in one of Graham Hancock's books. I forget which one it is that makes it very clear that he thinks that the Masons have been active since 11,500 BC, when they arrived as refugees from the planet Mars. Hancock has some good things to say, but that's not one of them. There are people. There was at one point a very serious, semi-serious movement to claim that the Freemasons are the heirs of the ancient Druids.
Okay.
I mentioned them in particular, partly because, of course, Druidry is one of the things I do, but also because one of the leading figures in one of the people who originally wrote important things on that subject was none other than John Cleland, better known as the author of Fanny Hill, the most famous book of smut in English literature. Exactly. He was a strange guy, but Thomas Paine, the American Patriot, also wrote something on that, and there have been many, many others. There's no justification for it, but he makes good copy, and so that was floated around for a while. These days, of course, you have all the claims that the Masons are actually lizard people from the constellation Draco, and this kind of stuff. I once had the chance to attend a meeting of a Masonic group in Seattle, and everyone who's going to attend was asked to bring a different Giddy theory of Masonic origins. Nobody came empty-handed. It was hilarious. People rattling off one theory after another, each one crazier than the last.
Okay. Do you think? I mean, just to really maybe just focus on it one final time, because it is where most people will go when they think of Freemasonry is worldwide conspiratorial, pulling the strings. Do you think a lot of that is because, and this is a question that I had that's separate to this, which is actually to do with the popularity of Freemasonry over time, is because for a long time, I think of George Washington being, the head of a Grand Lodge.
Good.
I think of even someone such as Joseph de Maistre, this absolute turbo traditional Catholic who was also a Mason. That there was a point of time for a long period of time where being a Mason was it seems the done thing, and when we perhaps retrospectively project, it appears that it's look at all these connections, but it's maybe finding a pattern where there isn't one.
Well, the thing is, there have been times and places where Freemasonry has engaged, or Freemasons, I should say, not the craft itself, has engaged in political conspiracy. The United States exists as a result of a Masonic conspiracy. If you look in a couple of lodges in Massachusetts, for example, in Boston, in their minute books, they still have their minute books back to the 1770s, and you can look in them and find the page where it announces that business is closed early on a certain night because of pressing business elsewhere. That night was the night of the Boston Tea Party, which was in fact organized in two Masonic lodges. What happened? It's not that Freemasonry as an institution did that. It's simply that guys in Freemasonry knew each other, knew they could trust each other, and so they tended to meet in Masonic circles and then spin off their own more or less Masonically organized societies. In the American case, it was the Sons of Liberty, headed by Master Mason and later Grand Master of Masons in Massachusetts, Paul Revere, who every American has heard of. I don't know how popular he is in England. And then you also have the Committees of Correspondence, which, where the Sons of Liberty was the militant arm. The Committees of Correspondence ended up turning into the Continental Congress. So that was definitely one. Another example are the Wars of Liberation in South America, led by Simón Bolívar. Bolívar was a Mason, so were all of his inner circle of people. That was very much a Masonic organization, and liberating Latin America from the rule of Spain was their goal. In Cuba, there were Masonic, and Cuba and the Philippines both. Masons played a very large role in the struggles for independence. So this has happened. It's just that it's not, sinister worldwide plotters planning to enslave us all. Masonry usually is on the side of democracy and freedom of conscience and freedom of speech.
Okay.
One thing I like to point out to people who are all into the evil lizard people or secret pullers of strings, Adolf Hitler, Vladimir Lenin, and the Ayatollah Khomeini have one thing in common. Each of them, as soon as they took power, banned the Masons. Okay. Meanwhile, of course, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Paul Revere were all Freemasons. So you tell me whose side you want to be on. It seems fairly straightforward, but that's one of those things.
So thus far, if someone had never heard of the Freemasons, they might think, well, why is a discussion about what seems to be just a group of people who know each other and who are trying to perhaps better each other's lives and met because of this guild structure,
do charitable work for the community and things like that.
And because of this initially because of this guild structure. Why is this appearing on a channel that deals with philosophy and esotericism? So why is it that type of thing, this Mason-based, guild-based group, transforms into something that has the symbolism that is akin to, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, for instance?
Exactly. Well, there are a couple of factors flowing into this. First of all, we are talking about the heirs of the people who built the cathedrals, who knew an enormous amount about symbolism and include that in their rituals and their teachings. And if you are an esotericist, you want to know about symbolism. This was especially true in the late Renaissance, the period that is rather clumsily called the early modern era these days, when there were a lot of people on the fringes who wanted to know about the old symbolic traditions, and where were they going to go? Well, there's this guild down the road that's accepting members who aren't stonemasons. So, to some extent, what happened was that the Masons had this body of traditional lore. To some extent, these gentlemen who joined, these esoterically interested gentlemen who joined the Masons, brought their teachings with them and proceeded to enrich the craft with them. They're going, oh, I know what that must mean. Whether it meant that originally or not, a lot of stuff got written in. And then you have the fact that the Masonic Lodge structure is an extremely flexible and extremely effective structure for organizing local working groups for ritual. It's better than most of the alternatives. You have specific officers with specific duties. You have a secretary and a treasurer. You have all of these practices and habits that make it very easy to run a group. And if the group is there to practice ritual or to pass on teachings, it's a great template. And so a lot of people took the Masonic template and ran with it. Whether we're talking the founders of the Golden Dawn, whether we're talking about Martinism, whether we're talking any of the major Western esoteric groups before about 1950, you'll find some elements of Masonic structure in there simply because it's an effective system and it works, and most people were familiar with it. So that's a lot of what was going on there.
Okay.
It is also true. It is also true that Masonic ritual does have noticeable effects on consciousness. When it's done right, it's very striking. Okay. And you're left going, wow, that was an experience. And so that tempted a lot of people to say, I wonder if we can take this and apply it to some of the more specifically esoteric purposes. And they did. And again, we have initiations like the Golden Dawn, like the Martinists, and so on.
So to build this up, if you wouldn't mind, let's begin with just the few symbols, because everyone will have seen these symbols, whether or not they find some relic
Oh yeah,
somewhere, or they watched an
yeah.
episode of The Simpsons, or perhaps they've just walked into an old town hall. To be honest, these
Mhm.
symbols are
Mhm.
still absolutely everywhere. So let's just begin with the world domination symbol. I'm kidding.
No,
We have the
if you could please tell me what that is, I'd be happy to know.
we begin with I believe it's the carpenter's square, the compasses, with a letter
Yes, the
G in the
square
middle. That's the one that most
with the
people
letter
would have
G in the
seen.
middle. Yes, that is specific to English and American Freemasonry. If you go onto the continent, they don't have the G.
Okay.
They'll typically have a star there instead. The speculation as to what the G originally meant is something that has occupied many Masonic pens through the long hours of the night. What you are told in a Masonic lodge is that it stands for God. And in point of fact, one of the basic rules for becoming a Mason is that you cannot be an atheist. You have to believe in a supreme being.
Mm-hmm.
They will ask you that, and they'll ask you that more than once. It doesn't matter which supreme being you believe in. There's a lovely poem by Brother Rudyard Kipling, for example, where he's talking about his mother lodge in India, where there are Hindu members and Muslim members and English Christian members, and they're all hanging out together, puffing on their charuts and talking theology in perfect, and perfectly calm, and then they head off home to their, off at the end of the night, and I know people in lodges that I belong to that belong to just about every religion active in North America at this point. But there you are. You have to believe in a supreme being. So G for God is certainly one of the likely contenders. It's also been suggested that G might have originally stood for geometry. Okay. A great deal is made of geometry in Masonic writings. We're descended from stone builders. Okay. So geometry was absolutely crucial back in the days when blueprints didn't exist yet. You actually had to lay things out with a compass and straight edge, or, if more precisely, a compass and a square. Now, let's go a little deeper, though. Why the compass and the square, notice they're usually set at two different angles. The square is at 90 degrees. The compass is at 60 degrees. And those two angles are very important in traditional sacred geometry, by which I mean here simply the geometry of the old cathedrals and churches. You would have some were built according to a pattern that focused on the square, that had lots of 90-degree angles, and squares and octagons were the basic structural things of the ground plan and the elevation. Some were built using a pattern of triangles and hexagrams. And there were symbolic reasons for these both. So these two symbols, the square and the compasses, represent those two patterns of geometry, as they were called ad quadratum and ad triangulum back in the day.
And am I right in thinking that these symbols, maybe we can draw a few more in, but these symbols sort of come together primarily as a system of morality?
Yes. The explanation of the symbols that's given in every Masonic lodge is ethical in nature. Can other meanings be laid on them? Well, of course. These are symbols. You can interpret. You can develop meanings in any direction you want to from a set of symbols, from any set of symbols. But yeah, the primary teachings that are given in a Masonic lodge are ethical in nature.
How would you describe the ethics? Would you say they're, is there anything notably different about them?
No, not especially. When the United Grand Lodge of England said, ours is a system of peculiar morality veiled in symbols, it's not particularly peculiar morality. If you were to pick up a book of morals for older children, your moral teachings for older children dating from, say, 1850, you'd find basically all of it there. It does, however, happen that a lot of people in our world then as now seem to need reminders of that, of even these basic moral principles, and Freemasonry tends to provide that. We have our failures, but by and large, you will do better trusting a Mason than by not trusting a Mason, or by trusting someone else.
Okay. We, a while back, I think you mentioned, and I think this is mentioned in one of your books as well, it's this sort of problem that modern day Christianity has, that it's subsumed all of its spirituality and all of its rituals and belief really into just a very flat form of, do this or don't do that. And do you feel, as Freemasonry is symbolic nature is based around a system of morality.
It,
Do you feel that
yeah,
that's
it
sorry?
very much falls into that same camp. I see
Okay.
that as a problem less with Christianity as such and more with Western civilization as a whole. We have tended to flatten out our perception of the spiritual into the ethical and moral. Ethics and morals are important, but they're not the whole shooting match. There's certainly no replacement for the experience of the divine. And for the last few centuries, we've tried to treat them as though they were a replacement for that, and the results have not been good.
You personally feel that one almost will struggle, almost in a Nietzschean sense, to act ethically if they haven't had that experience first?
If they haven't at least brushed against it, it becomes. I would actually point to Kierkegaard here rather than Nietzsche, where Kierkegaard talks about the difference between the night of infinite resignation, night as in K-N-I-G-H-T, or the night of faith. The night of infinite resignation is his critique of Immanuel Kant, actually. And it's the person who does good because they have chosen to do good. You can hear the gritted teeth there. And it's a very Kantian kind of thing to do. The night of faith has actually, the one step toward the divine that our culture can usually handle now and again is faith, is the reaching toward what we cannot yet perceive. And if you're introduced to that, introduced to some basic spiritual practices, and you have the sense of something listening on the other end of your prayers, then it becomes a lot easier to make that ethical, to make the ethical life possible. It's less the gritted teeth, less the the frantic struggle. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, huge question just to throw in on a conversation that's meant to just be about Freemasonry. Where do you stand on the question of good and evil? Do you believe there is an innate thing such as good?
That's an exceedingly complex question because there are our moral sentiments have at least three levels. There are those that are based on biology, because we are animals, we have instincts. There are things that we tend to shy away from, and things that we tend to seek. There are then cultural habits, and then there are habits based on individual experience. And in any one person, all three of these are busy at the same time. And talking about good and evil, almost always, you're dealing with one or another of those. Is there something beyond that? If it is, it's something that's accessible by mystical experience and in no other way. Which is why we really can't rely on that as a basis for living together as in a society. We simply have to accept that, okay, here are the rules that we have evolved. You can hear Edmund Burke in the background here. Here are the rules that we've evolved over time. To the extent that they seem to work well, whether or not we can justify them in any absolute sense, they appear to work fairly well. Where they do not work well, it's appropriate to discuss the matter and make careful changes to them. As, for example, in the 19th century, when we made the change of deciding that slavery is immoral. Okay, that was a thing where a lot of people wrestled with that. The decision was made in various countries at various times. In the United States, we fought the most blood-soaked war in our history over that little issue. Other places like Britain and Brazil settled it in much less sanguinary method. But it was still a matter of something that was not seen as a moral necessity came to be seen as a moral necessity. It came in. It worked. I don't know many people at all who would argue against slavery at this point. And so I see morality like law as something that evolves out of the experience of humanity, out of the experience of each people, each society, and out of individual experience. We have these teachings that are handed down to us, and it's important to study them because they represent the best that the past has to offer us. I tend to read, whenever I'm in difficult times, I tend to go straight to the old Stoics. I read Epictetus, I read Marcus Aurelius, and take that as my compass when I'm floundering, and it works.
So, jumping back to Freemasonry, do you feel that these symbols, which then develop into rituals, as it's a system
Hmm.
of morality, they are there to sort of lead people towards
Oh yeah.
a deeper
Hmm.
understanding of
Yeah.
those morals?
Hmm. The thing about ritual and symbol is that they speak to the levels of the mind below the conscious. Um, you can believe in some moral virtue and be completely unable to carry it out in your practical life because it's only on that thin layer of consciousness. And one micrometer below the surface, you're still thinking otherwise. You're still going, I want it, therefore it's mine, or what have you. Um, the advantage of ritual and symbol is that they go below that. They help you to install these patterns, these images, these ritual actions below the surface in the subconscious mind. And so the subconscious mind starts going, okay, I get it. This is what I should do. And so that's the advantage of that. The more sacramental churches tend to make an effort toward that also. It's one of the things that got lost in the aspects of the Protestant Reformation that dropped ritual and dropped symbolism and simply focused on a personal confrontation with God through the Bible.
Mm-hmm. So, huge question. Annoyingly
Mm-hmm.
abstract. You mentioned in both books that Freemasonry has quite literally like thousands of initiations, thousands of rituals,
Mm-hmm.
and many of them just no real idea, where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
And so firstly, I mean, maybe you could chat a bit about that, but also the bigger question there for me is, why does a ritual work even if everyone involved doesn't know what the hell it
Why
is?
it works? Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
basically.
Well, actually, that's the easy one.
Okay.
You don't have to know anything about automotive mechanics to drive a car. You don't have to have, the fuel ratios in mind. You may not have any idea how a carburetor functions. You know how to operate it. And if you follow the rules for operating it, you can drive.
Okay.
In the same way, if you do the ritual exactly as given and follow the instructions and try to make it a little dramatic in the appropriate places and so on, it doesn't matter if you have no clue as to why it works. Because again, it's talking to the subconscious. It's not a conscious process. Okay, so that's the easy one. Now, as far as the rituals, oh Lord. Okay, what happened was that first there were the entered apprentice and fellow craft rituals, and shortly thereafter the master mason. As I mentioned, the master mason about 1720 got added to it. Over the next half century, there were a trickle of other rituals coming in. At first, they simply added them into the regular lodge of 3 degrees, and then they kind of spun them off into their own little groups. And then the 18th century, the second half of the 18th century and through the 19th century, the golden age of ritual composition. And people all over the place, especially in France and Germany, but not just in there, created rituals with wild abandon. Say, wee, here we go. And they usually came up with forged charters. My favorite example is Martinez de Pasquale, who was one of the 2 founders of the esoteric tradition of Martinism, one of the 3 founders actually, and who was going around the south of France in the 1750s, 1760s, founding lodges all on his own. He had a charter which claimed to be signed by Bonnie Prince Charlie, of all people, giving him the right to pass on these initiations and found lodges. And that's all, almost certainly the House of Stuart had nothing to do with it. Almost certainly it was a complete forgery, but it was the necessary scrap of token legitimacy. People piled into it, and he had this rather complicated set of rituals that started with Masonry and spun off into a kind of Gnostic white magic. He was one of hundreds. This was the time when 2 orders that were, I think, both headquartered. No, one was in France, one was in Italy. The Rite of Memphis and the Rite of Mizraim. They had respectively 90 and 95 degrees of initiation, with a ritual for each. They later were fused into the Rite of Memphis and Mizraim because there was a lot of overlap, which had 99. I don't think anyone ever took it beyond that. But there were all these rites running around, all of these rituals, all of these initiations. And so in the second half of the 19th century, you had a real move to kind of compress things and sort things out, especially here in the United States. One group of people associated with a particular set of degrees that had come from France and therefore were called the Scottish Rite. I know it doesn't make any sense to me either. They assembled a set of 29 degrees that required the first 3 degrees of Masonry as their foundation, and that's the Scottish Rite as we have it today. Then there was another outfit which had nothing to do with the city of York in England, or the city of New York for that matter, which thus obviously called itself the York Rite, and it got together a set of 10 degrees in addition to those original 3, and then added in a bunch of other stuff as kind of side degrees and alternative degrees and invitational degrees. At this point, the York Rite is about as complex as the Scottish Rite, and that's most of what's worked in the United States. You have the York Rite, you have the Scottish Rite. If you're really desperate for more degrees, there are a few other rites running around that you can get into. But there has been a real tendency to narrow it down to the point that it's actually possible to support the existing rites we have on the number of people and income and so on that we actually have.
Okay, so the difference between the rites is largely a location-based, a pragmatic thing?
Well, it's okay. Basically, the Scottish Rite has one set of degrees. The York Rite has another set. The Scottish Rite tends to meet in its own buildings. Mm-hmm. The York Rite very often uses the 3 degrees are usually called the Blue Lodge because blue and white are its colors, the symbolic colors that are used in. So there are a lot of blue lodges. Most York Rite bodies meet in their local blue lodges. There's a lot of overlap there. And the Scottish Rite is kind of out on its own. But there's a lot of overlap between the degrees. There's a lot of common symbolism. You get Knights Templar symbolism on both sides. You get various and sundry other stuff. And so it's just which degrees ended up in which stew pot in the bubbling, the busy kitchen of Masonry in 19th century American Masonry. My understanding is that in Britain, most other places, it's much less well organized, and there's all kinds of rites and lodges busy doing their own thing. But yeah, one of those things.
So, for those listeners and, for those who aren't, but for those listeners who are a bit more familiar with, I guess, esoteric ritual and symbolism, I mean, of course, if you can't give any example, I completely understand, because I know it's fairly secretive. What is there a possibility of giving an example of what a Freemason ritual looks like? Of course, you don't have to go into specifics.
What I can do is give an example from another ritual of the same general class, because this same template that was picked up by that was evolved by the Freemasons was picked up and used by hundreds of other organizations, actually thousands to be more precise. So what happens in this basic template, which I write about in my book Inside a Magical Lodge? Okay, there you are waiting for things to start. You're sitting in the anteroom. Okay. You and perhaps there may be several other candidates who are going through. There are strange muffled noises coming through the door from the lodge. You don't know what's going on. Then somebody comes through the door. He's wearing some kind of strange outfit, and he blindfolds you. And he leads you or you and the other candidates into the lodge, where you are confronted by various people who will say things. Maybe at one point the blindfold will be lifted, and you'll see something, probably something a little startling, and then down it goes again. And you'll be taken around in what seems like total darkness, and you rapidly become kind of disoriented. And then you're asked to take an obligation, to make a promise that you will keep the secrets of the lodge and not pass them on to anyone else who's not a member. That you will treat the other members of the lodge as the way you would like them to treat you. That you will help and assist them, and keep their secrets as they keep yours. And then the blindfold comes off, the lights come on, and you're shown a bunch of some gestures. Okay, the secret signs and secret handshake and things like that. And you're shown some symbols. Mm-hmm. Usually in Masonry, they're on a thing called a tracing board, which is what it sounds like. It's a large board or poster that has the symbols, and the master will be pointing to this one and pointing to that one, telling you what it means. Then you get sat down on the sidelines. You're pretty dizzy by this point. and a bunch of people kind of talk you down as though you'd just been on a drug trip and explain to you all over again what you just saw. Okay? Then the lodge closes down and everyone goes for coffee and snacks. So that's a basic, that in kind of stripped down form, that's a Masonic initiation. And anytime you go through a Masonic degree, you're going to go through some version of that. There are lots of variations. There are lots of changes rung on that template, but that's the basic template. Now, Masons are, as I suggested, are not the only organizations that use it. Up until the middle of the 20th century, most American labor unions had initiations of the same kind. Many of them had ladies' auxiliaries with initiation rituals of the same kind. Our college fraternities and sororities have very similar rituals. Lots of groups did, and of course, esoteric lodges. The description that I just gave you was largely modeled after the neophyte ritual of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which anyone who wants to could study these days. And it's a good example of that kind of ritual. It doesn't reveal to you any of the secrets of Freemasonry, but it shows you what kind of ritual structure you're going to be getting. Very few Masonic degree, well, outside of the Scottish Rite, where funny outfits are required. In most Masonic degrees, though, you don't have the ornate outfits that are worn in a Golden Dawn temple. They were kind of on the far end of over-the-top, colorful. You can tell the Golden Dawn was a late Victorian creation. It has that sort of Victorian knick-knack heavy, brightly colored, lavishly painted sort of look, like your great-grandmother's mantelpiece.
That certainly sounds like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So, I was listening to one of your talks on Freemasonry, and you said something. You said something fairly. I was quite surprised that you said it, because it's quite a broad brushstroke to paint. And obviously, last time we spoke about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn are extremely influential. But you say sort of changing the quote, philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. You say that majority of orders since 1717, as in other orders, are just footnotes to Freemasonry.
Yes, it's quite correct.
Yeah.
If you know your Masonic rituals, if you've been through the three degrees of craft Masonry, and you go into any magical order created between 1717 and about 1950, you will know instantly what's going on.
Okay.
There you're sitting in whether it's in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn or a Martinist, a Martinist lodge or an OTO lodge or any of these things. If you have that Masonic background, you will be instantly familiar with most of what happens, and it will just be, oh, how interesting! This is bringing some changes on those familiar practices and those familiar habits.
Okay.
So it's that, and again, that was something I kind of expected when I became a Mason, when I was made a Mason, and it's something that I found to be true in spades.
So what happened in 1950?
After the Second World War, one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that there was a general revulsion against occultism right after the Second World War. I think part of it had to do with enough rumors coming out about what the Nazis were up to in terms of their occult activities. But there was a general revulsion against and rejection of occultism, traditional occultism. I mean, you had the rise of Wicca, for example, and people had absolutely no interest in the old lodges. No, they wanted to take their clothes off and run about in circles in the woods. Better them than me in February. But there was a real rejection of that old pattern. And so you had, there's a lot more recent things, although Wicca has some borrowings. You can tell that Gerald Gardner was initiated into an order that derived from Masonry. The prehistory of Wicca is a complex topic and kind of an amusing one. But but basically there was a real disruption there, and a lot of what's been going on over the last 75 years has really been a matter of most people turning their backs on the old classic occultism, the old Masonic derived orders, and so on, and a much smaller number of people, of whom I'm one, who have been scrambling around trying to save as much as possible.
So not only are you a Burkean conservative politically, but also esoterically. Because I mean that non-jokingly as well. Because one thing you've emphasized before on the podcast is that this whole very modern idea of esotericism and occultism being to do with sort of leftist witches or left-wing chaos magic or sort of postmodern left-wing type things, is that actually your own opinion, as I understand it, is that the history of esotericism, I guess up until the 1950s, was really very conservative. And so do you see that that Masonic structure as perhaps the bastion of that form of
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit here, because generally speaking, the serious conservatives have rejected Masonry because many of the established Christian churches have rejected Freemasonry. Masonry is centrist, and I tend toward. My stance is considered practically to the right of Attila the Hun because I'm a centrist. I am a moderate Burkean conservative, but there's a lot of conservatives way off further right than I am. I'm closer to the center than most people in the conservative world. I get into trouble for that some of these days. Sometimes I remember with some amusement when I was taking heat from both sides for posting a Burkean conservative argument for same-sex marriage. Mm-hmm. It made perfect sense, but on the one hand, the people on the right were going, no, we can't have that. The Bible says, well, the Bible isn't my holy book deal. And you had people on the left saying, well, that's bad because it doesn't base it on our set of beliefs. I'm saying, well, tough. I don't, So, but this is why, for example, Masonry supported the American Revolution and the revolutions against Spain and so on, as in fact Edmund Burke did. Mm. It was it's a complicated thing, and especially now where things are so polarized, anything in the center, the far left will call right wing, and the far right will call left wing.
I guess this is probably to tie into the question I asked about good and evil, but do you? And I don't mean this cynically. Do you believe there is such a thing as a center, or do you believe that is also moving and contextual?
The center is always moving. The left and right are always moving. Mm. Okay. At any given time, there are people who are trying to pull in this direction, people who are trying to pull in that direction. We assign them the notional labels of left and right, and what those labels stand for change dramatically from time to time. It has not. It's been maybe a century since environmental conservation was a right-wing issue. It was supported in England by the Tories and rejected by the Liberal Party, as was the main left party then. And of course that changed over the course during the middle years of the 20th century too. So you have this. There's all of these things are almost more tribal labels than anything else. They're always in flux. And the center tends to be more. It's less. It's skeptical of the claim that anybody has the answer to social problems. Mm-hmm. It's going, yes, there are problems. Let's see if your proposed change will be any better than what it replaces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so, that's the sort of, as I've heard you describe Burkean conservatism before, you've said, let's see if this works now, or let's just look back and see if something worked in the past. Seems very simple, but people don't like to do that.
It's the application of the precautionary principle to politics. And it works really well. You engage in social change where that's appropriate, but you do it in an incremental fashion, so that you don't land yourself in a worse place than you got. The reason that Edmund Burke was strongly in favor of the American Revolution and just as strongly opposed to the French Revolution was that the American Revolution was very incremental. All that the American government did was replace the British Crown with a federal government that had essentially the same powers but more limited. Whereas, each of the 13 colonies maintained its own laws. It maintained its own relative flexibility of action. So it wasn't that big of a change. Changes followed, but they were done in incremental fashion. But then you find the French Revolution, where it's all, let's tear it all down and establish this abstract rule of reason. And of course, it turned into a complete disaster.
Yeah.
And Napoleon Bonaparte ended up just coming in and cleaning up the wreckage. And then plunging Europe into 20-odd years of war.
Do you see then, that pre-1950 occultist, let's say, political strain is actually more, not necessarily isn't emphatically political, but is actually tethered to what has a million names in occultism, the middle way, equilibrium, whatever you want to call it, it's that balance.
Yes, in any given period, excuse me, in any given period, there were some, occultists, like everyone else, fall into different categories politically. Eliphas Levi was a socialist. He was a moderate socialist, but he was a socialist. Some other occultists of the same time were fairly well, like monarchists and so on. And so you had a certain amount of, there was always a fair amount of wiggle room in there. People of different political beliefs, political agendas could meet and carry out occultism. This is why it's normal it's absolutely mandatory in Masonic lodges, but it's also normal in most esoteric lodges. You don't talk politics in lodge. Because that gets in the way of being able to work together. You don't bring up politics. You just that stays outside the doors of the lodge. And so, in a Masonic lodge, I may be sitting between somebody who's fairly far to the left and somebody who's fairly far to the right, and we're sitting there talking about some unrelated topic and having a fine time and getting to know each other. That's one of the strengths of Masonry, that it allows bridges across, these political divides.
Do you think then from that sort of political magic or political occultism is sort of inherently entropic, that eventually it will just collapse?
It can be done, but it's extremely risky. I think I note as a good example the way Dion Fortune ran her campaign to preserve Britain during the Second World War, where she kept everybody's efforts strictly focused on building up the national egregore of Britain. Mm-hmm. And that worked. It probably cost her life. She died, less than a year after the war was over, I think it was. But she managed. Not only did she manage to succeed, the British Empire had a far less bloody end than most other empires do. It unraveled in a fairly calm, and there was a fair amount of bloodshed here and there, but it was nothing like the way most empires fall. And so you can do it, but it's risky. Mm-hmm. And if you let yourself get sucked into any of the usual traps, especially into the mistake that she always cautioned people about, don't focus on hurting the other guy, focus on helping your own side. Don't try to destroy the other side, try to build up your own side. If you lose track of that, you're doomed.
Because nothing's free.
Nothing's free. But also, I mention this every time I talk about practical magic, and an enormous number of people say, oh, that can't be the case. And then they go out and prove my point. What I like to call the raspberry jam principle. Most of us learned in childhood that you cannot spread raspberry jam on anything else without getting on your own fingers. Okay? Magical influences are the same. If you are sending out energies of death and destruction, those will stick to you and they will bring you down. If you are sending out energies of blessing and healing, those will stick to you and they'll benefit you a great deal. So, and yes, I know it's old-fashioned, it's stuffy, it's practically Victorian, it works. And so one of the great differences in the recent battle of magic that we saw here in the United States that concluded on November 5th, one in which, as far as I know, Freemasons had no role, by the way. Trump is not.
Well, you would say that, wouldn't you? You're Freemason.
Well, the last American president who was a Freemason was Gerald R. Ford, the man who famously could not walk and chew gum at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah. Masonry in the United States used to be a big deal. We used to have lots of presidents, but that was a long time ago. These days, these days we are, as I said, mostly lower middle class, upper working class. It's one of those things.
Do you sort of put that largely down to the sort of condemnation from Christian churches of Freemasonry?
No, because it's primarily the most of the people who, Christianity in the United States is mostly something you find in the lower middle class and the upper working class. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of common ground there, and in fact, most of the Masons I know go to church or synagogue on a daily or on a weekly basis. They're fairly religious. No, it is rather the atheistic, agnostic, materialist temper of our upper classes. Many of them do not believe in a supreme being, and so they're not eligible to join the Masons. Many of them see no point in hanging out with a bunch of old fuddy-duddies who are practicing these rituals of morality. We know what kind of morals our upper classes are engaged in, and they're not something you'll learn in a Masonic lodge.
Okay.
But the point I wanted, just cycling briefly back to November 5th, one of the great differences over the last 4 years, I have been ever since Trump first surfaced on the national scene in 2015. I've been watching the emergence of dueling groups of occultists, pro and anti-Trump. And the thing about the anti-Trump side is that they have been all focused on hatred and rage. They're all about hurting and destroying and trying to kill Trump with their magic, okay? And the people who are pro-Trump are trying to boost Trump. They're doing the positive thing. And look what happened. It's the same thing that the unfortunate demonstrated. The Nazis, by all accounts, had an enormous number of people casting nasty spells from the SS headquarters of Wewelsburg, their ritual headquarters. And the unfortunate had her network, which was focused entirely on strengthening Britain. Look what happened. Who won? So I don't expect this to have much impact simply because, on what people choose to do, simply because we live under a tyranny of niceness. Everyone's supposed to be nice. Everyone's supposed to be, we can't have hate. So an enormous number of people are just desperately looking for some way they can vent their hatred and rage. Mm-hmm. And Donald Trump is one of the reasons he's so successful, one of the reasons he has so much energy, is that all these people are pouring their hatred and rage into him. And that's just energy. That just strengthens him. Mm-hmm. If they could actually forget about him, he'd be much less dangerous. But they can't. They can't let him go.
A master magician lives rent-free in your mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he lives. Not only that, the thing is, he is the ultimate bad boy. We've raised several generations of women, who have been taught that they should be attracted to nice boys, and they're not. And you can see that they're not if you go to any singles bar and get a drink and sit back in the corner and watch. But they think they ought to be. They're actually attracted to the bad boy. Donald Trump's the ultimate bad boy.
Down the line, we'll have a full conversation about this because we veered quite. Is there anything you'd like to add about Freemasonry you feel is key, or that
now that we've cycled away? Well, the thing is, Freemasonry is dowdy in a way. It has its dull moments. If you become a Mason, you're going to spend a significant number of evenings sitting with a group of old guys who are going through an argument that has been going on at regular intervals since 1956. And these are, if you will, the sort of sacrifices you have to put up with to get access to the symbolism, the ritual, the traditions, and so on. But it's, and comparing that to the fantasy that you get from the secret masters of the world brigade, the fact that many Masonic lodges are still bickering about how they're going to pay for the annual banquet, much less how they're going to run the world. That in itself is there's a certain hilarity in the comparison there.
Mm-hmm. So I'll be sure to put the links for your 2 Freemasonry books in the description below. But I mean, what are you working on at the moment?
Let's see what I have. What I'm working on at the moment, I'm working on another Ariel Moravec occult detective story. Mm-hmm. I am working on on the third book in my series of workbooks. I've done the Occult Philosophy workbook and the Earth Mysteries workbook, and the next is a Life Force workbook. So that's an interesting project, and I have some ideas after that, but I haven't really settled on any. Oh, actually, one other thing I have coming out in January, in fact, a book on mundane astrology. One of the things that I do alongside my writing is issue predictions based on traditional, what's called mundane astrology, the astrology of politics, about political and economic conditions in Britain and the United States for 3, 6, or 12-month periods, depending on the details. And I've written a book on how that's done, and that'll be out. It's called The Astrology of Nations. It'll be out in January. And I'm beginning to put together the raw material for a second book on how to use natal transits, basically where the planets are in relation to your own birth chart, for timing things in your own life. This is a good day for you to submit that manuscript to a publisher. It will be more likely to be published. This is a bad day for a romantic evening, and Mars is applying to a square with something in your chart. You're going to quarrel. Wait until Mars has passed that. I've been doing that for many years. Actually, it's been about 10 years now, and it's during those 10 years that my income has gone from moderate to quite comfortable. Mm-hmm. So I have some reason to think that it actually works. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's that. Those are the current projects, and there will be more. I have lots of things to be interested in.
Okay. Well, as I said, I'll put the links in the description below. But once again, John Michael Greer, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I've appreciated it as always.